we had a white rabbit, which was considered crazy at the time, you know, and actually pretty. He was the best we could get for that time. He was singing a falsetto tenor. And we were actually good. It was like a novel, right? You know, although I think the Double Vikings, there were some integrated groups in R&B. I think the people who sang Come and Go With You from the Air Force, I think they were called Double Vikings. They were integrated. But they were, we never saw them. We saw them very rarely. Anyway, we sang in little clubs and at record hops and stuff, and we sang in school gigs and stuff. But I was able, by being a singer, to get out of going to high school. Pretty much. I mean, I didn't have to go. I had a permanent pass, so to speak, and I used it. So I stopped going because I think at that high school there were maybe we were bused from the projects to this high school in the Bronx, I think there was like 5 blacks or 6 blacks in one school. And all of the black students, except myself and a woman named Diane, I just made contact with, who was also in the choir. They were probably more like 7 or 8, but they were all put into class retarded kids. And Freddie, who we sang with, and I knew very well, was not retarded. Nor were any of the kids in that class. And it was just, it begins to, when you look back at stuff like that, you say, well, stuff that you had to accept, that this really now makes you very angry, and that was one of them. And we felt powerless, of course, and students, and of course, they taught me powerless, but my way of dealing with it was to not go, not to fight. But of course, there was other aspects of that racism. But they used to have, at the time, called bus pass, student bus pass, a transit pass. And so you were able to, I was able to travel all over New York City with this pass and unpaid. So I got to see a lot of downtown. I got to discover the goods and stuff, and just walk around and fly around. So that was great. That was, if I had designed a high school course, it might be those things. But anyway, I should go back on the media to give you a contrast of what I thought of English poetry going to Hunter Green and the dancing professors and stuff. But what about Barnes? It just really didn't sound like it, And this accent, it's like, it's kind of stuff which is great because I knew that I didn't want to go anywhere. So we were and all these black writers put together, and I forget this, it's amazing, I forget the sequences of events or details and kept a little diary. But I remember one thing was very distinctive. There's this guy named Lloyd Addison who had this poem, and it's probably not called The Aura and the Underworld, that is the title of his book. That was, no one can hear me, huh? Same thing that happened to Steve Canner. He thought, yeah, somebody said, yeah, but it was talking too fast. I was like, huh? Well, there's acoustics in there. There's a very loud room. Lloyd Addison, he wrote the aura and the A-U-R-A and the U-M-B-R-A, the aura and the numbers. And that's the title of a book that was published by Paul Brennan in England. And here's another side. James Thompson, yesterday talked about this, the collection that he did with Paul Brennan, who at the time was publishing a series of African-American and African artists, writers, poets, a poetry series. got connected with the civil, you know, the Martin Luther King, the sit-ins, the freedom rides, the whole thing. It was like right there, right? So now as a black executive, this was like, you could not have hoped for any deeper immersion into what was actually happening on the movement. And there's a thing that I cannot, another thing that's difficult to convey to people, especially young, is the physical feeling that I felt when, you know, when I knew of people who were struggling in the South, who were fighting, you know, and I felt it viscerally, I felt it in my heart, and I think a lot of people did. So it was an amazing feeling, though, because it was a consistent feeling. It wasn't that this kind of came in one like a hot flash. It was like a steady thing, and it wasn't anxiety. It was like some kind of hope and fight back. I mean, this is after having, you know, lived through the 50s and going to a school that totally slouched, and now finally we had some kind of something going on. People were really excited, really galvanized. And so Tom was in the middle of that, and he was very good at what he did, like kind of organizing things, you know, making sure that things flow right and, you know, and move. And of course there was also SNCC. Now SNCC at the time, I don't know what the history would say. I read some of the history that the kids are reading now in elementary schools, and it's ridiculous, but there was, I always thought, a great unity among the civil rights groups. And SNCC was always really I always thought a lot of inspiration for a lot of this from the youth point of view. Because SNCC was the Jefferson Institute Nonviolent Coordinating. Whereas, I mean, this is interesting how it's set up. The SCLC was essentially churches. You know? The Legal Defense Fund and the NSP was essentially lawyers and people around different notes. So I mean, almost like everybody was covered. And then you had the urban league and you had the core, which at the time was much more militant and left-wing and very close to SNCC with the Congress for Racial Equality. And so, I mean, you had a choice. You could belong to any one of these, they were all like really positive, progressive. In fact, there was a guy from CORE who was at the early meetings named Margaret Gore, who was another public relations type, very well spoken, and he was also writing poetry. I mean, everyone pretty much, not everyone, but you could see with vernacular poetry of your language, that almost anyone can write it, right? I mean, it's not like something that's like exclusive literature. It's like everyone has access to this. It's like R&B or something, you know? It's like the blues, you know? You want to express yourself, you know, and read it to somebody, you know? And that's kind of the accessibility of poetry is what I love about Umber, because we had some people who walked in there as painters and walked out as poets, you know, and maybe vice versa, you know. But that accessibility kind of turned everybody on, and so we were rolled in that environment. It was a very exciting and heady environment. And there are sort of many other aspects that I could tell you about. Okay, let me just tell you a couple about other workshops which began to happen at Tom's on 2nd Street out in Theater. It was like an open house. Whoever came there was welcome, you know, and it was packed. It was like a small place where people just packed in. And I don't know, there's something about people being packed into a room that it actually can be very exciting. And it was, but and the workshop, as I would have to talk a lot about later, which I don't know why, but it was not a solely black workshop. I mean, far to the contrary. People brought their friends, the people that were involved in there, and whoever they were, right? And that was a good thing. It also was not a workshop that had a problem with people who were homosexual or gay. As James Thompson yesterday, he's gay. He was talking to that point. He was talking about how he still felt, you know, estranged in many ways, but he was always a part of the group, and that can go off with a whole lot of different things, but I think that basically UMBERA was an open organization that anybody, and because it wasn't an organization, it was a meeting of But James Meredith, who was doing the integrated Mississippi University or whatever, Ole Miss, he came to our workshop. Andrew Young came to our workshop. Charlene Hunter came to the workshop. You know, a lot of slick people loved the workshop, so they came. And they were very excited because they were right down here in the South. And I told myself, I said, you know, I think a lot of us really wanted to go south. Yeah, you wanted to, you know, it was like that was the front line, you know. And while there was a lot of money to be raised in the North, and we did work a lot of fundraising in the North, and there was a lot of races we did with in the North, I think a lot of us really wanted to go to the front line. I guess it's like Pearl Harbor or something. And so that actually is what pretty much happened in many ways. So there were also other people involved in the workshop, other type of artists, there were writers, there were musicians, Archie Shepp and Cecil Taylor were close to the workshop. They played for the parties that we had. There was a whole contingent of painters. Gerald Jackson was probably the main painter who hung out at our workshop. He wrote poems, he published them in the 90s. He was a good poet. There was Jack Whitman, who was very close. They all designed posters for us. He had these great posters. Joe Street, Luther Van, a few I'm sure I was forgetting somebody, but we used to get these one-of-a-kind posters made, not thinking, and then put them up in the Stanley's Bar somewhere, and they'd be going the next day, right? We used to, gee, somebody took our poster. It was fabulous, beautiful thing, and I guess.
Art.
Yes.
Art.
They were wonderful. And I don't know if we had any photographs of anything. It was a great tragedy, but it was great, beautiful stuff that came out of the visual artists who really, you know, felt strongly about it and joined us. In fact, Gerald Jackson and those guys, they had a short-lived organization called Eclipse, you know, which was kind of like playing on the number thing. And James Thompson was telling us yesterday, the jazz musicians formed the jazz composers, formed the jazz musicians composer organization, which was actually, which I understand I was modeled on UMBERA. I said, well, if the bodies are good, why can't we just get together? You know? And which was, he said, a very powerful organization until they kind of got taken over, they kind of got co-opted. And I must say right here that poets, people of the word, often find that visual artists and jazz is completely naive about like the different words and stuff. I mean, like, you know, I think I do believe that poets are more comprehensive than a lot of the other artists. I mean, really don't know. You're gonna have to do your organs, you see, because it's something but I have to tell you, one of my moments, I honestly have heard art tends to be right. But anyway, the Jazz Composers organization did come together. They did a lot of great work, and they were very powerful for a long time. I don't know to what effect the people in Chicago, but the AAC, you know, whatever has to do with the jazz composers here. But that's something that I think that really should be explored, because I do happen to feel that that precedents are important to people in present time. That things were done. Once you know something was done, I think it helps you to do something variation out to kind of move forward. So that's what we're kind of really into trying to provide this to people, especially to youth, because we found with UMBERA that a lot of them didn't even know it existed. You know, we never really cared, really, because UMBERA was always a very mystical organization, only for people involved, really. And it wasn't, I didn't care either. I didn't know one did, because we were happy with where it wasn't until Tom died. And Tom died, and we realized that maybe we should do something about this. And actually, at the same time that Tom died, these girls, they're not girls, they're young women, well, not that young, they're in their 30s, early 30s. And Franklin Sermon, they were serving young men said, they had been to art school, you know. They had studied about, you know, the art in New York and the movements in New York. And of course, you know, hesitant, they never heard of Red Cross. And it's not taught in the curriculum. I mean, you know about the curriculum. You know about what is and what isn't the curriculum. But anyway, I had to tell them that wasn't true. I mean, that was a very well established organization that people, other people on the side knew about it, downtown, art scene, et cetera. And they desisted from that. And of course, after just when Tom died, I also told him that it's a very bad time to get into this, and that what you were going to do is to do what you were doing now. It's kind of a public campaign, let people pass on idea what's happening. And so this library, this part of town, and everything, we kind of adopted or mutually adopt this library because it's right across the street from where we used to hang on Avenue D, which was almost kind of exclusively black kind of sector. We had a black bar and stuff, and it's still, we look at it, it's like the South Bronx. And Avenue D, you know, and you go out and see and be entertained by it, you know, it's strange, but here in the back of the wall of progress that goes all the way down, you know, huge population. You look at the stores and the resources, there's nothing, you know, so it's really, yeah, so there's a lot that hopefully we can do for this region because it's not that good. So I got off on a tangent, talking about UMBERA. But we're, somebody has to help me.
So you,
we're talking about the young women who UMBERA, an organization called UMBERA.
That's aside, but they're not called Apple.
yeah, so you're talking about what is about today, about understanding.
It's sad that we said that Tom Dempsey died. We were going to get together and say maybe it's time to look at the world game. And we went to, then I reminded you of the stupid young women. Oh, I'm glad we got to this anecdote.
This could be a teaching technique. Because kids, you know, say, oh, class, I forgot what I was saying. You don't tell me, you know, and then we can write them instead of
Say recess.
Exactly.
Do you want to throw in questions?
Actually, I would like to kind of finish a little bit. Anyone that has a question at this point, because I was trying to answer it, but I didn't want to ask a question.
No, why don't you get ready about that?
But I just have to, that was a long sidebar. When we were back, let me just go back then to civil rights, and a lot of people went to the South. The atmosphere of the time in the early 60s. Okay, so a lot of things happened. UMBERA's first edition came out and it was very popular. It was great. People just loved it. You know, and of course, we were very popular in the community. We had a fundraising party and we actually fed it. It was very cheap. It was a very cheap party. People had made red beans and rice, and we fed everybody to eat. There's a lot of extraordinary that happened. Steve Cannon gave us over, which is excellent, by the way. We talked about actual numbers. He said at the time, I never looked, he said there was about 350 artists living downtown. He said it was a very small number, so most people knew each other, actually. And we were also, and this, I don't know if people know this Bohemian business, we were all to a person like 54. We loved the none of us had a lot of money. Oh, a lot of us didn't have any money. People were hungry and stuff, living in very cheap places. So we were trying to make ends meet. In this area down here, people considered it to be a slum. I mean, I remember, and I was tell you, coming from, when I first looked east from 3rd Avenue into the darkness, that was the lower side. It was a foreboding area because it was very dark. You know, and this one, I mean, you know, it's strange. You know, but anyway, this was a very poor area, and we had these parties. We fed a lot of people. We were involved in the community, so we were involved in the poets who went to open meetings. They go, you know, into the metro, and at a certain point, and this is a little bit after the time we're talking about, Anyway, the Greens came there. The Greens came to the Garden Force for a while, and in between the time when they eventually would go to St. Mark's Church to support the project, but we were there for about 3, 4, 5, 6 months. And I must say that those 8 months, who was running for Congress on the progressive labor ticket, we had an evening where he addressed the proposals. And it was a great moment. We gave a beautiful speech, you know. And that was a nice scene. And then, of course, eventually went on to St. Mark. So we were involved in the project. In fact, we had, before the poetry project got there at St. Mark's, we had a Umber Arts Festival. We had musicians playing, we had art, we had poetry. And it was like great, you know, and everybody came. You know, people had no problems, you know, with us being involved in the civil rights movement and dealing with our blackness because everybody was doing their own stuff. It was very different, like the people in the peace movement. You know, Ed Sanders and Ruth Wayberg and Alan Ginsberg, we were all, you know, down with the peace movement. Of course, this was a little bit later. But at the same time, I think that Vietnam was happening then. There was also, ban the bomb. Ban the bomb. Right? You know, it was like nobody wanted to nuke of things like so great. And he had a lot of charisma, and he could do things like he had that was good for us. And of course, they sent all those troops down south, right? So anyway, I was, some people felt otherwise, and it got into a physical thing, although it was not what do you call it? We did have our physical moments. People got excited, angry, whatever.
Y'all was a gang.
Gang among gangsters. Yes, a gang among gangsters. But this, some people got excited and they wanted to take over your organization, and they got, militant and angry. They said, wow, look at these guys. So, we went through our thing and consolidated the thing and continued to publish the next issue. The primary people who were involved with wanting to physically take over UMBERA and to, whatever reason they had. Strangely enough, one on the UMBERA, we were the time to go uptown and form the Black Lives Preparatory School Theater. I guess no one ever told me what was up with the people who were involved with, trying to take over UMBERA. Not that, I'm sure they felt that they, wanted to do that, but I thought it would also be good to communicate kind of what was going on with people, just so we were on the same page. But I don't think he cared anyway, and there's a lot of interesting things people said about that. But that was Charles Patterson, asking what happened to the way Ishmael, who didn't go uptown, but he went off on his own. I think that I don't know what he was doing. And there were a few others who,
And all of this shit was here with you guys?
no, it's from Black Lives West. But anyway, they went on with the Mary. Now, I must remind you now, we all have always had our disagreements, right? But still, everyone was behind Mary and Black Lives West. The poetry benefits and went uptown and actually wrote in the school with Mary. But we changed it from Mary Rock and the whole crew. Son Rob was up there, Joe Street was up there, and Calvin Hunter taught the course up there. I went up and read. But the main thing I remember was we did a meeting with Malcolm X was killed. And I think that this had more of an effect on what happened in UMBERA. And with a lot of people's life, it's an ending because, Malcolm meant a great deal. I can't tell you what it was because Malcolm was a medium. He was very articulate. And he knew how to fake, and, he knew how to do sound bites, and he just knew he had the techniques down. And he looked great, had an image. I mean, this is, media image 101. So when Malcolm got assassinated, I think that really just messed up a lot of people. I know that myself, I kind of wanted to some kind of funk and went underground and lived around the Lower East Side, the backs of the buildings and stuff. Almost some kind of weird thing, wound up hanging out with a guy, Bob, what is his name? I was going to this bureau that should have been packed this building, which is great because I was considering myself to be underground. So, that's really way to be underground. We were living in the back of a building, like 9th Street, no, this was actually 12th Street. But this guy who was kind of like the patron, he kind of was some rich guy who drove around a chauffeur car, I had somebody driving. He was an air traffic lead to the Daily News. It so happened later on that this guy was driving around with a dead body in the back of his truck. He got sent away. And he was like, of course, the people who kidnapped and killed the woman also had him riding around in Trump and that was Stockwell gave his memoir. Talk about that. It's a terrible thing, but and I was telling Calvin what great information they had on the field, because they knew this, and that's why they wanted to win, because they knew that something very serious was happening. But meanwhile, there was this whole business with the Black Lives uptown. There was a problem uptown with Black Lives, which eventually had Black Lives to New York, New York, Jones, and they eventually just wanted to do it. I always felt very wrong that it was not a good idea to go back to Harlem, because I know that Harlem was, I had some James Thompson brought that, well, people were at that point were ready to go out on their own. I think there's a lot of truth to that. I think the people who were disgusted with the way we were running were ready to go their way as well. They wanted to be more involved, more militant. Almost like Robert Williams, physical, gun type military aspects where I think that a lot of us felt that we were better off as poets. Unfortunately, as Walter Cole said, he said, you wanted people to arm themselves and have weapons to defend themselves. But he said, what happened was I think that they started shooting each other, and that's what happened to some extent. Larry Neal got shot uptown in Black House, and that led to their moving to Newark. Now, John Farris is going to give his orchestra, I think, tomorrow and next day. And he knows that area very well, and also knows about what happened uptown very well. He told me that whole shooting of Larry Neal was a shootout, and that it was just not Larry. There was a whole lot of shooting going on, and that was not. We were, I would say, we were past. We were more to be about trying to get with the word. So we stayed downtown. Malcolm had to be killed with a big funk on him. What we did was benefit for Black Rock School at the theater in the village, where we all read, all of us together, people from Black Rock, people from UMBERA. Everybody still on? No, right. Okay, so now UMBERA at that point ceased to be what it was, but what it subsequently became was something that I thought was very interesting and quite different. I eventually would go to New Orleans, to the South, to join the Free Southern Theaters. And I went to a lot of the South, which I had really wanted to do. And this was like probably around 65. And I kind of got firsthand how it was, or some aspect of how it was. We got stopped out there outside of Boston, Georgia, which was the worst place to get stopped. And the Free Southern Theater caravan, but luckily for us, or not, because this was all very well organized. When we got stopped, as soon as we got stopped, this very long black car drove by with all these very well organized black men. And these were the Leaders for Defense, and there was another name, but I had never heard of these people before. They pulled up and just stopped. They didn't get out of line, and so the sheriff said, "What's in on name of these crackers, man? God, man, they're throwing this change, and and then we just went on. It was, this redneck kind of thing." So that was my, one of my little incidents that brought that stuff home to me. But I would subsequently work with freedom singers and Glenn Chandler, doing concerts in the South and stuff of that nature. And back here in the North, because it was still essential to raise money, and the South was still a very poor place, and people were still disenfranchised, so they didn't have any access to anything. So some time went on. Now, when James Thompson was here, he talked about UMBERA was continuing. James Thompson had taken over UMBERA with a fellow named Lennox Rockwell, who was one of the original proposals, and Steve Cannon. And they went on to interview with Rockwell, which was going to be the centerpiece of the next issue of UMBERA. Only the problem was that like 2 years had elapsed and nothing had come out. And so Tom, on one of his trips to New York, I think this was after I had been South, said, and we had talked about it when I was in New Orleans, because Tom was running for something there. That I would take the magazine and try to do something with it. black and white poets, mixed poets called. We had a bill, we read this there, we got sort of about 1,500 seats. Very nice event. So we raised money, we did another issue, which featured Sun Ra on the, and also the cover was a very interesting figurative art piece about the figures in the South at the time, George Wallace, Douglas Wallace, et cetera, had some elements of the Kennedy assassination. It was an interesting figurative cover. Anyway, we featured Sun Ra. There's a piece that actually I have some copies of that's in the current Handbone magazine on Sun Ra. And there was a chapter on UMBERA in there, it talks about UMBERA's relation to Sun Ra. What happened was, as you see, that UMBERA did continue, but it did not continue as an organization that came out of the political bag. I think at that point on, UMBERA was purely an arts organization, or a writers thing, and it wasn't in politics, or at least I would say the origins of coming out essentially of the Communist Party in a lot of things, like Calvin in the Communist Party and being in mainstream magazines, with Herbert Aptheker and Shirley Graham on the masthead, who were great. I mean, when I look at this, they were whispering that because there's an article by Peter Khrushchev in this. And I'm saying, God, look at this. This is really, and I don't know what else I'm going to tell you, but I'm looking at, I'm thinking now, and I might be totally emphasizing too much that between the nationalist politics, black nationalism, a lot of people thought, look, it's going to be black nationalism, just be with black people. That's all. A lot of people thought that. And that's a very valid feeling. And some of us in the group thought that, and they won that way with it, right? And those of us who remained felt differently. And the same was leftist politics. I never really understood communism or socialism or any of that stuff, or even, anarchism to the extent beyond the point at which people who were disenfranchised or really messed up would have help, would have somebody in their corner. The ideological stuff, Stalinism, I never read books about that, so I really didn't care. But I did know what was happening in the neighborhood and who was, standing up for the common person, the person who was having a hard time. And so that was my leftist politics. So the other stuff I could never understand. They say, oh yes, you see these arguments, all those Trotskyites over there, and these and I never got it down. And I'm not going to read. I tried to read Trotsky maybe a couple of times, and this wasn't my type of literature, But I did read Richard Wright when he talked about his problems, in this aspect and that aspect of it. We had I think it was in the Long Dream, or was it the Outsider? We had both the extreme right-wing guy and the extreme left-wing guy just clubbing each other to death, just kill each other. But anyway, what happened in UMBERA is that I did take it over. Did do an issue, it was called the UMBERA in 1967, 1968. And there was other people involved. Anybody who had ever been involved in UMBERA was always in this to this day, free to be involved at any point. And I can say that the people who were involved with UMBERA in that short period of time always had a link. So there was never a problem about going anywhere to anything. Even the people who were mad at each other at some point. After that small period was over, there was always communication and goodwill and cooperation that was very important. So we did that issue, and then we did, and the people in the groups at then were like Len Chandler, although we had a lot of people from SNCC, Nancy Chandler, and then some of the other people, and we had a workshop, we met for downtown, and Barbara Crystal, who I would eventually marry, would also be involved with that, and I was at City College. And so UMBERA, from the civil rights and anti-war, at the time became more involved in education reform. We did the mission strike at City College. led to local traditions in college. And I was in college, and Calvin mentioned Tom did, not Tom, but Calvin, Lorenzo Thomas, a lot of others became involved in teaching, as did Calvin Hicks in educational reform. And whether I was a target or not, questions. So let's see, now let me, at this point, I'm going to say, now, just to continue to this point. Now, I don't know, I eventually moved to California, and where Ishmael Reed was, and me with Ishmael Jones, who was living down here, we formed another organization, called My Generation. With Ortiz Walton, a bunch of West Coast artists and stuff, and we tried to do this organization. I think we realized at that point that everybody's really essentially have their own organization and to cooperate, But, the spirit was always there to cooperate. We always did. Ishmael did some great work with Asian Americans, and with Native Americans. We did before Columbus Foundation. I worked at the Third Row College at UC Berkeley, and got into radio. Essentially, my class to go to KLX, the campus radio station, and then we would eventually go to KPFA, where we started Third Row College there, and work in terms of communication. And Lorenzo was out in Texas, doing a lot of great work, with blues and with education and poetry in the schools and education in schools. And we eventually found the University of Downtown Cultural Enrichment Center, which is a really nice thing. And there are others who did similar things. So I felt at the point that UMBERA, and also UMBERA, the last issue that we published as a, in terms of literary, was the UMBERA Latin Soul, where I got involved with a bunch of Latino, Chicano, South American, Puerto Rican artists, poets, and visual artists, and pictures in that schools. And I put out this issue of UMBERA called Latin Soul, and we got into this whole Latino thing. And Victor, coming from the Lower East Side, 111th Street, became a huge hero to the Latinos. I mean, we really knew very little about where Victor was coming from. And he had a whole wealth of things about salsa, about some kind of pan-Latinoism, point of phrase, that they were kind of not involved with. So Victor, knowing his black roots also was very important. Was able to give them a lot of information. So you had a guy, for instance, a couple of months ago, Paul Flores, one of his students coming through town, who was Victor's his mentor. And I was in the coast of, and everyone speaks very highly of Victor. Now, there was a very important thing that happened in the coast with these people who were Latin Soul, that Roberto Vargas, Alejandro Rivera, and Victor, and these Latinos in San Francisco, during the time of the Sandinista, they actually resurrected Sandino, published a literary magazine with Sandino on the cover. It had poetry readings for Sandino, and eventually wound up putting together a contingent of people from the Mission District, like in the District of San Francisco, who went down to Nicaragua and fought in the war to liberate Nicaragua. And of course, Alejandro writes about that. Huh? No. Sometime Alejandro and God was there. So they were, Alejandro, when they got down there, were like 100 guys standing on the hill, It's a revolution, right? This is great, And they probably have like 10 guns or something. But